Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining our session here today at the Mining Law Summit at the University of Arizona. I am Melissa Sanderson, and I'm formerly with Freeport-McMoRan, retired last year, and am now running my own mining consultancy, Mel Sanderson Consulting. And I'm here today with Professor Doug Guthrie from Thunderbird School for Global Management. He has deep China expertise and a lot of familiarity around the mining issues. So that's what we're going to be discussing today is perceptions around China's approach to commodities, access, development of mines, relationships with society, do they respect ESG, and what are the realities? So I think probably I'm going to be mostly misperception here, and Professor Guthrie is going to be Mr. Reality. So, Doug, any introductory words that you would like to offer?
Well, thank you, Mel. And it's okay if I call you Mel.
Absolutely.
Thank
If
you.
I can call you Doug instead of
You can,
Professor
for
Guthrie all the
sure.
time.
I prefer Doug. So yes, thank you. Thank you, Mel. And I do want to say, just in terms of my background, I've spent my life my adult life as a China scholar. So I started out studying language, literature, and history many years ago in the 1980s, then became obsessed with China's economic development and the economy, and did my PhD in those areas, and then became a professor that studied economic reforms, and then also studied these approaches to issues in business and trade, and have consulted with a lot of companies and been a lobbyist. And then I've also been a dean of a business school. And then finally, from 2014 to 2019, I was on a different end of the spectrum. I was an executive for Apple in China. And so I've had a long career that has kind of taken me through a lot of what China is doing in the economic development space, and also how foreign companies operate within China and are dependent on China. And so that's sort of my background. I will say that my main areas of knowledge and interest are on economic development in China and the ways in which foreign companies are dependent on China. I know some about the mining industry, and the collection of rare earths and things like that. And I'm going to do my best to bring all of those things to the forefront in our conversations here, because I know those are the interests for you guys. And then finally, after I left this little company called Apple, I joined the Thunderbird School of Global Management. And it's been an interesting ride and a twisting road. And I hope I can help people understand what's going on in China today. So thank you, Mel. Back to you.
All right. Well, I will begin with a couple of things that have certainly caught the public's attention around China and commodities extraction, particularly on the African continent. I myself lived in the Democratic Republic of the Congo for 8 years and was working for both the American Embassy initially and then Freeport, building a brand new copper and cobalt mine in the Congo, which a couple of years back, we actually sold to the Chinese. But I will tell you that when I was working with the embassy in the DRC, there were many reports of trucks passing through in the night in Lubumbashi, which is the capital of the Katanga province, the source of most of Congo's copper exports. And these giant unmarked trucks would go rumbling through the middle of town in the middle of the night. And they were driven by Chinese who were taking copper out of the country for refining and further export in neighboring Zambia. And that was back in the period of 2003 to about 2006. So I had some indirect experience with illicit Chinese mining in one country in Africa. And I do not by any means intend to imply that the Chinese are the only ones that ever engage in illicit mining activities in African countries, because unfortunately, there are plenty of other so-called bad apple players. But it certainly left a sour taste in the mouths of the Congolese and subsequently made it difficult for Chinese companies to enter and operate legally. They had bid on a couple of concessions, and the Congolese government simply rejected their offers. So they more or less entered the Congolese market by the purchase of Tenke Fungurume mining. And since that time, they have encountered the usual operational difficulties of any mining company trying to do business in the Congo. And now their contract is being reviewed by the government due to allegations that, oh, they haven't paid their taxes on time, they haven't been treating people well. And so, Doug, I want to come to sort of these kinds of allegations, and also the issue of illicit or only semi-illicit mining development. In a world where China is becoming so much more aware of and attentive to its international reputation, do you think that these things occur frequently, rarely? I mean, certainly it's not government policy,
Right.
is it?
So Mel, it's such a lot there. Wonderful question. And by the way, I didn't know before this particular conversation that you worked for Fremont. That's amazing. Like what a fascinating journey for you, and amazing. And let me just kind of break down your question into a sort of historical narrative. So forgive me for giving a long-winded answer, but I think it's important for our participants to hear this entire narrative, because it's a really important process. So first of all, remember, when China began the economic reforms in 1979, the country was a disaster economically. I mean, they had weathered the Mao years, and it was really, really a painful time for China. And so when Deng Xiaoping comes to power in 1979 and says, suddenly China's open for business, manufacturing, we have 800 million people living in abject poverty, let's go, right? Anybody who wants to come, and we'll produce your tennis shoes or your garments or whatever you want. Okay, tennis shoes and garments are a good way to enter the global economy, and we've seen a number of countries in Asia in particular enter the global economy this way. But this is not really what is the sort of heart and soul of the global economy in terms of complex manufacturing, electronics, automobiles, in the new era, I mean, the more recent era, things like electric vehicles and batteries, like these are the big things. And all of those things depend on rare earths and mining. Like you just can't make that stuff without things like copper and neodymium and like all of the other things that are kind of come out of places like Africa, right? And so like it's a really important transition moment, but you have to think about China's economic development in epochs, right? First was just basic manufacturing using labor. Then there was attracting foreign companies and trying to think about things like complex manufacturing, from GM to Apple to Samsung. And then you have to start to think about resources when you get into those complex businesses, and that has to do with mining, okay? And so that's just sort of the backdrop. And then we go through the 2000 to 2001 when China entered the WTO to 2013, which was sort of the Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao era. And then 2013 plus is the Xi Jinping era, which is the era we're in now, right? Okay, so China's definitely in this space. Now, it's interesting to me in your question that you noted the years 2003 to 2006, right? So this is before China's announcement of, and it was a soft announcement, but it's before China's announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative. So there was a period very clearly in the early 2000s when China was like, wow, we got Apple here, we got Samsung, we got Huawei, we got we need all of these rare earths, and we need to like move. And so it's very interesting, Mel, to listen to your stories about this, because I've heard those kinds of stories from other people too. And yeah, it was, I don't like to use the word, but it was an exploitative period. Like it was just like, we need minerals, we need rare earths, we need to figure out how to do this. But it was before China had really thought systematically about how to build its whole relationship around the world, right? Now, in 2008, and as a China scholar, I feel like I watched China fairly closely. I sort of missed this. Like there was sort of a very soft announcement in 2008 of this thing called the Belt and Road Initiative. And of course, the Belt and Road Initiative alludes to historically what Admiral Zheng He, who dominated the South China Seas and East Africa and the Middle East, and then the road, Marco Polo's road, from Europe across Middle Asia and to China. And so it was this idea of China actually rebuilding itself, not as a fundamentally dependent player on the United States and the West, but instead building itself as the developer of mining and a number of other aspects that would really help build these countries infrastructurally. But when you mentioned, Mel, 2003 to 2006, this was before that. And so there was a lot of illicit behavior. There was a lot of just trucks coming in and like mining, and then trucks going out, and nobody knew what was going on. So they formalized this plan or this deal in 2008 called the Belt and Road Initiative, which is, we are going to formally help these countries develop an infrastructure being mines, but also infrastructure being roads, railways, ports. And everybody's going to benefit, right? We're going to be the leader. Chinese leaders thought of it at the time, we were going to be the leader of the global South, if you will. If we think about the global North as advanced industrialized nations, the global South as poorer nations. There's a word in Chinese called Nanan Hezuo, which means South-South relations. We're going to be the leader of the global South. Some scholars refer to this as China's Marshall Plan, right? So referring to what the United States did to develop countries after World War II. This is China's Marshall Plan. Now, initially, when some scholars started looking at this, they thought of this just as, okay, China's trying to develop new markets and they're trying to get access to minerals. But it actually is, I think, a very deep commitment to the regions. Now, of course, China has economic interests for being committed for exactly the reasons that you mentioned, Mel. 2003, 2006, they were just after those minerals, and you'd have trucks rolling out in the middle of the night with minerals in the back. Today, it's a much more developed system, which is really about developing these countries economically. I mean, if you look at Kenya, China has done a tremendous job in developing the railways and road systems that kind of give them credibility in this system. So when you have trucks rolling up to mines now and taking rare earths out, it's not viewed as the same thing as trucks rolling out in the middle of the night. It's actually, oh, those are the Chinese firms that did this. And so to answer your immediate question now, I think Chinese state policy has shifted. It's shifted from, trucks rolling out from Congo in the middle of the night to actually developing an economic development plan, which then allows for partnering among the mining of things like rare earths. And right now, even though a lot of the rare earths and minerals that are needed for companies like Apple and Samsung come from a lot of places outside of China. China is the number one miner and refiner of rare earths in the world. And so it's very clear that they've kind of shifted the policy to really get what they need. So let me pause there, because that was a long-winded answer, but I hope that got to some of your questions now.
Oh, it wasn't long-winded at all, and it certainly prompted a couple of reactions that I want to share now. I suppose that in my Western-centric view of history, and I think many others, take exception to the characterization of China's international policy, particularly around commodities, as resembling the Marshall Plan. because there really was not the same degree of economic self-interest in the Marshall Plan as there is in Chinese policy towards economic development south-south. It remains demonstrably a very China first policy, which is absolutely antithetical to the basis of the Marshall Plan. And for those who might be watching this Zoom, the Marshall Plan was a post-war program to help Europe reconstruct economically after World War II. So I take exception to that, and I would say that many African countries also are now taking exception to that. Because what China has done in Africa in many cases is to say, you know what, I know that you need roads, and I know that you need a power plant, and I know that you need a new school system, and we'll be glad to come in and build that for you. But here's the two catches that take place in real life. Number one, they are getting mining concessions to pay for those services. And that's not exactly an equal exchange. And the second problem and before I leave that point, we had the very startling example where I believe it was the case of Mozambique. They were behind on their payments to the Chinese, and that was for a port that the Chinese had constructed for them. And the Chinese sort of said, okay, then in that case, we're going to take the port back and we'll run it and operate it ourselves, and you won't get any revenue from it. And that sort of sent shockwaves all over Africa, because again, just to contrast it to other existing models, a lot of African countries have been behind on their payments to the World Bank or to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. And those organizations don't come in and seize an economic asset in order to assure repayment of their loans. We negotiate, change the dates and change the interest rates to make it more palatable, etc. So I think that there's a very pronounced difference in the way that China approaches those interactions versus the West. And the second thing that I would say to that, and oh, by the way, you mentioned the railroad in Kenya. The Kenyans have canceled that railroad contract because they were not satisfied that the Chinese were using quality materials, which is another whole round of allegations that roads are crumbling, railroad tracks are crumbling under the weight because they weren't high-grade steel, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that these are sort of realities that perhaps the Chinese government has been a little slow to adjust to. But again, that's my perception. So I'd like to hear your reaction to those.
So thank you, Mel, and I love to have a good debate around these issues, and hopefully it makes it interesting for the participants. Let me just approach it from two perspectives. So I hear what you're saying about equating what China's doing as in the development of the Belt and Road Initiative as China's Marshall Plan. Maybe a little bit of a misnomer or misappropriation of the concept. I'm not the only scholar who has talked about it that way, but just to be clear, the U.S. had a lot of other alternative interests or ulterior motives in what they were doing with the Marshall Plan as well. Like, the idea of the U.S. emerging from World War II after just the devastation that occurred across the globe because of that period of time. But the U.S. had clear economic interests in what they were doing in economic development. It's just never been the case that the U.S. is, the hallowed, virtuous nation. We have a long history of creating dependent development in South America. And by the way, and this is an interesting thing, and it's just a little bit of a tangent, but let me go here, Mel. Part of China's rise right now, and part of Xi Jinping, is because of the way China was treated at the hands of the West in what is known in China as the century of humiliation. Just let's think about this. The Century of Humiliation started in 1939, or sorry, 1839, with the first Opium War. And most students that I teach, when I ask them, and we get to conversations about Hong Kong, and I ask them, do you know why Hong Kong was colonized by the British? And they usually say no. And I was like, well, it was a drug war. Like basically Britain fought a war against China over the right to sell opium in China. And they won the war, made China pay for the war, and they occupied its crown jewel of a city. I mean, so, and that was just the first. There was a second Opium War, there was a Sino-Japanese War, there was, the Boxer Rebellion, the fall of the warlord period, the rape of Nanking. So there was a lot of stuff that China went through. And so I guess I just hesitate to think of like, yeah, the Marshall Plan was a good plan and it was about rebuilding nations after World War II. But to think that their US doesn't think about things in economic interests is just, I just don't buy it. Like, I think the US is the same as China and a lot of other nations are. That being said, to go back to to the second part of this point that you made, it's absolutely true that China has not necessarily not been a good actor in a lot of the ways that economic development has happened, particularly in the 2000s. I think it was a very, very laissez-faire period in the Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao regime. And I think there was a lot of bad things that happened during that period. And I'm not excusing China for that at all. I do think that China has a very clear vision of this notion of South-South relations. And they are, if I could use the word, aggressive, if not brutal negotiators over these things. I think today, and Mel, I think you know the Africa region better than I do, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but today under Xi Jinping, they do think more carefully about these issues. Like, it's not the rough and tumble area of the Wild West in the 2000s. Like, they are thinking about these issues, they're hearing them. I hear what you're saying about the Kenya Railroad, but I think a lot of these things are about the government trying to deal with what actually the abuses have had, and realizing that if we are going to emerge as the largest economy in the world and the leader of the global South, and thinking about our relations in Africa, at least the contacts that I have in the government talk much more openly about their sensitivity to these issues than they did 10 years ago. And so I think it's a work in progress. I think it's complicated. I think China knows, I mean, to bring it back to our issues, issues of mining and minerals and rare earths, they know where they need to be and they know what they need. But I also think the government is trying to grow into this role of being a leader of the global South and actually thinking carefully about what they're doing. They're not doing it perfectly, and I'm not here to defend China, but it is, I think, an evolution, and we're 10 years beyond where the worst part of it was. Does that make sense to you, Mel?
No, it absolutely makes sense. So I want to pick up a thread that you've mentioned a couple of times, and that thread is rare earth, which, and many people watching this conversation already know that in some ways the term rare earth is a misnomer, because rare earth materials are not necessarily rare to find. There's large deposits all over the world.
Yeah.
What makes them rare is what they're used for.
Right.
So what I want to talk about is rare earth, China, and environmental and social governance, ESG. Because certainly in the United States, and perhaps to an even greater extent in Western Europe, we are seeing right now a sharply increased attention to and emphasis on ESG performance by mining companies. I'm sure many people have seen the articles that say companies are trying to greenwash their credentials by buffing up their sustainability reports instead of actually taking genuine new actions to substantially increase their spending on ESG issues. We have the Securities and Exchange Commission actively looking at imposing reporting requirements around ESG. which is following in the pathway of Western European regulators. So particularly American and European companies are facing this scrutiny. And in some ways, it's ironic because the US industry already operates in the vast majority of cases, because you can't ever speak for an industry and say that everybody is following all the rules. But in the vast majority of cases, American companies are already operating to the highest global standards of environmental technology, environmental stewardship, social and governance aspects. Mining companies invest a great deal of money, for instance, on social programs, particularly in overseas countries, where entire communities are rebuilt, schools are built, hospitals are built, education is provided, because mining companies chasing these minerals, rare earths, copper, etc., are operating more and more in countries where government functioning is marginal at best and frequently impeded further by extensive corruption. And of course, who suffers the most for that? The people on the ground. Where are the mining companies? In that same ground, surrounded by those unhappy and deprived people. So we have that dynamic. And then we have China, where, even very recently, there have been reports about absolutely scandalous environmental behavior. And more or less, the excuse publicly made has been, well, there's so much pressure to get it out of the ground fast. We don't have time to play around with all this clean environment stuff. We have to get it done because our factories need these materials. We have to get them to the processing plants, and we have to keep our economy rolling. And it gives the impression that the Chinese mining industry, and by extension, the Chinese government, has very little concern for ESG. So let's launch there, and then I'm going to go down a few more steps on the rare earth path.
Sure. So let me again follow the pattern that I've just followed. So I'll push back and then agree. And here again, I know we love to talk about, how well the United States is doing in these areas of standards. But having worked with some and consulted a number of companies in this space, everybody hides behind the idea that when we have our own mines, we do very well. But when we're outsourcing and working with partners, we can't control what the partners do, right? And this is just, so you sound a little more sanguine about like what the US is doing than I do. But I've seen it too often that, yeah, we talk a good game, but the basic model of globalization over the last 40 years has been an outsourcing model. Nike got in trouble for this in the 90s. Mining companies have gotten in trouble for this over years. The company that I used to work for got in trouble with this. You can't make the claim that we believe in ESG more than any other country in the world, which I don't actually think is true. I think there are other countries in Europe that believe in it, but let's just say we want to put ourselves in the top tier of this. I've seen many cases when US companies are working with outsourced manufacturers in a variety of sectors, including mining, and they'll say, well, it's not our fault. Like we didn't, we don't run those mines. Like they're not our mines, and sometimes companies do well at putting pressure. Most of the time I can't say most of the time, but most of the time in the companies I've worked with, not so much. And so, we have to just recognize one issue, Mel, that US corporations are driven by one thing. I mean, maybe not one thing, but they're primarily driven by one thing: shareholder value, right? Like what they want is windfalls for the stock market, and most of the executives go to the bank and do share buybacks, and they make lots of money from these things. And so profitability is king here still. And we drove this. Milton Friedman drove this. Like this is not, this is a US invention. And so I just like, you and I might disagree on this, but I just think our hands are not clean. we're better because of the social movements in the United States than a lot of companies and countries in thinking about this, but we're not great, my opinion. Now, second, to go back to the China issue, I hear what you're saying. Like, I think that there's lots of cases that we can point to where just bad work has been done. My own experience is that, especially in the last 5 years, and as much as I worry about Xi Jinping and what he's doing, like, I've seen this under his watch. I have one organization that I work with that audits organizations around this, and the biggest issue that they're interested in is ESG. Like, they are interested in how Chinese companies think about ESG, how we can train them better, how we can think about the design of ESG. And so, you know, China's rapid growth and its rapid expansion into the world and the rapid expansion of BRI, you know, there's not the level of control over this that we want. But my sense is that Chinese companies think deeply about ESG issues, not just because it's a hot button issue on WeChat and Weibo, but it's actually a hot button issue for the government, which is what Chinese companies really care about. And so my view of Chinese companies is we're not there yet, in terms of how firm we want to be about these issues. And there are lots of bad actors, as there are with every economy, even with US corporations. But I do think that there's a real attentiveness to this in the Chinese government right now, that may take some years as a lag to actually get really set in motion. And I know there's a lot of pain around the world. So people are like, yeah, okay, you can talk about that, but still the abuses. I mean, we read about the cases that are happening in Africa that are just, you know, corruption cases. But my sense is that there is a real attentiveness to this because China is thinking about its growing role in the global economy. It's thinking about the fact that it's got soon to be the largest economy in the world. You know, whether we like that or not, it's going to happen. And then the case is, like, do they want to be a leader? And do they want to be treated as a leader? And my sense among the leaders in the government that I know is that they think about that issue a lot. So let me stop there, and I'm happy to drill down deeper on anything that you want to talk about. But yeah, those are my views on it.
I'm going to pull a page out of your book, and I'm going to smile beautifully and agree with part of what you said, and then fundamentally disagree.
Okay.
Because the part that I 100% agree about is actually twofold. No, and I think I might have said this. There's no industry where everybody is conforming to the law fully. Doesn't exist. You always have bad actors. Every country, every industry. 100% agreed. I also agree that in the past, it was a nicely facile excuse to be able to say, oh, well, you know, we're not operating that, or that's a subcontractor and they engaged in this bad behavior, and what can we do? However, thanks to the US government, there's a little thing called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And there's one of the fundamental purpose, for those who might not know, of FCPA was to ensure, or try to ensure, that US companies were not encouraging, supporting, abetting, and aiding in corruption in countries outside of US borders by the payment of bribes, by the giving of gifts, by the undue use of influence, or other means that fall under the definition of corruption. And that other means clause in particular allows for a very broad interpretation of US corporate actions globally. And one of the provisions of FCPA says pretty bluntly, you are responsible for what your subcontractors do. If you are paying them to do work on your behalf, you are responsible if they are engaging in corruption while doing work on your behalf. You are responsible if they are engaging in environmental violations. You are responsible if they are engaging in social violations, et cetera, et cetera. So, and of course, obviously, Western Europe has a very similar law. Many people would argue that European companies have a little respect for that law. That's another discussion. We're here for China and mining, so we're not going to go there. But that would be my pushback, because as far as I know, China doesn't have a law that resembles the FCPA, and there are widespread examples of essentially Chinese companies showing up with the suitcase to get the job done.
Yeah.
So there's my pushback, Doug. Your turn.
Well, thank you, Mel. And as you know, I enjoy dialogue and enjoy pushback. So please, please, please keep pushing back. And you're right. And I guess I would just want to also push back on this sort of stark, caricatured comparison of like suitcases of cash versus other things, because there are lots of ways. I mean, if you've been in the rooms, you know, you've seen it, like, or I've seen it. And yes, like FCPA does, it's a good law, and it mitigates to some extent against the explicit use of these kinds of practices for corporations to get what they want. But there are lots of ways. And, you know, I've not seen this as much in Africa because I've not been a consultant and an executive in Africa, but I've seen it in China. There are so many ways, and that, you know, you say that FCPA falls into a pretty broad range of what you can do, but there are lots and lots of ways where executives can make promises that effectively, I need to be careful saying that, but effectively these are bribes too. It's just that they're not suitcases of money, like, but eventually they end up being windfalls of capital for the local officials that a given company is dealing with. And so it's, I hear you, and I hear what you're saying. And like, I think the US is trying to do right by these kinds of questions. I don't think the corporate sector is so great. Like, I think there are lots of ways that the corporate sector has found ways around this. And I'm not comparing the US corporate sector to the Chinese corporate sector in terms of what they do, but nobody's hands are clean here. And so I do applaud the US government for having something like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, but I don't know, like, you know, when you start to think about like what happens behind the doors and behind the scenes in these rooms where negotiations happen, I'm not so sure we're as different as we think we are.
This by itself, again, is one element that we could spend an hour talking about, and probably still be unable to reach any clear conclusion. So I'm gonna move on or come back, either one, however you want to interpret it, to the specific subject of rare earth.
Okay.
I have the privilege to serve on the board of Western Rare Earths, which is a junior mining company that is in the process of trying to open a rare earth mine in La Paz County, Arizona. So right here at home. And the company owns 3 separate rare earth deposits in the United States, but the La Paz deposit is our flagship deposit.
In Arizona?
Right here in Arizona.
That's amazing. That's great.
Yes, yes. And every indication is that potentially, we're still finishing our exploration drilling, but potentially we're sitting on what could be the largest identified rare earth resource in America.
Amazing.
So yeah, kudos to Arizona, kudos to WRE. So I offer that as sort of a preliminary statement that I am now involved in this segment of the mining industry directly. So one of the things that I learned in my board responsibilities, because I was by no means an expert in rare earths, I had worked in copper, cobalt, molybdenum, but never rare earth. I learned that around the world, the single biggest problem with rare earth is that it tends to be closely bonded with radioactive materials, specifically uranium or thorium. Thorium being even far worse than uranium. And it's those radioactive elements, so-called penalty elements, that make mining rare earth expensive, difficult, sometimes very controversial, and has in some ways led to China's position as the world producer of rare earth.
Mm.
Because again, coming
Can I
back
ask you a
to,
quick question? I'm sorry to interrupt. I
no,
want to
go
hear the
for
rest
it.
of the flow, but just a question. Is that because China pays less attention to the dangers of mining radioactive materials?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
And that's exactly where I was going with this.
Got you. I'm sorry. Sorry.
Absolutely, because, you know, their regulatory measures and their concern about, you know, how do you dispose of safely, and how do you store, and where do you store these radioactive elements, is less evolved, shall we say, than, for instance, the regulatory regime in the United States. We have a very particular issue in the United States in that we have been arguing for almost, at this point, two decades about uranium storage in this country. We have a storage facility, the Yucca Mountain Storage Facility. But if, and this is the hypothetical, if we were to really aggressively begin to develop the rare earth resources in our own country, we have to have some place to store the radioactive byproduct. And Yucca Mountain needs expansion, and it has not been authorized for expansion. So we effectively have no storage capacity for these penalty elements. And the other reason that the presence of these radioactive elements matters is it makes the processing of the actual rocks incredibly difficult in order to extract and separate the valuable elements like the niobium that you mentioned earlier, Doug, or scandium, or any of the other array, to separate and debond those into their concrete streams is also very difficult, because you obviously have the lingering presence of these penalty elements.
Right.
So that also has contributed to China's position as the world's leading processor of rare earth elements.
Yeah.
Now, everybody, I'm sure, who's attending this Zoom conversation has seen the press reports for several years, stemming from an initial incident in which China stopped rare earth exports to Japan over a trade conflict.
So 2011, East China Seas. Yeah.
Exactly. And everyone, basically everywhere, has extrapolated freely from that incident to say, oh my gosh, China's always ready to pull the switch, and we are economically dependent on, quote, an enemy state for materials that we need in order to build our green economy. So here's a hypothetical scenario. I'll give you two hypothetical scenarios. Political relationships between the United States and China worsen, and there's an incident. And China says, okay, we're going to slash, burn, we're going to cut off your rare earth supplies. What are the effects of that? Well, companies like Tesla or Lucid Motors here in Arizona, or Nikola Motors here in Arizona, or Core Battery here in Arizona now don't have access to materials that they need, or at least not reliable access and in sufficient quantities to support demand. That's huge. Second potential scenario, less draconian, and therefore, in my opinion, more likely. There's a political blowup between China and the US. The predicating basis is the same in both hypothetical situations. But China does not overtly take any action related to rare earth. And again, in my hypothetical scenario, Western rare earth is now producing. We actually have a mine, we're producing product. We have done the first stage processing here, that is the grinding and separation, physical separation. And now we're going to export that product to China for processing. Number one, we have delays at the ports on our side. We finally get on a boat, we sail over the sea, then we have delays at the port in China because they're suffering the exact same kind of issues that the port of LA and all the other US ports are suffering. So that's not any sort of nefarious thing. It's just what it is. It's a supply chain disruption. We finally get our supply into mainland China. We truck it to the processing plant. Here comes the nefarious part. China's upset with the US. The processing plant gets this material from the US and it goes to the bottom of the processing list. And it stays on the bottom of the processing list as all kinds of other materials flow in from other sources. And again, what is the consequence? Economic development in the US in those domains that I've mentioned is effectively strangled. So there you go, Doug. Here's a fun one for you.
Wow, those are great, Melissa. So Mel, let me just, I'll try to take each one in turn. But let me just give as an overarching banner or theme work. And, you know, I've been a scholar of these issues for many years and sometimes been a consultant and a few times been a lobbyist. I fundamentally believe in the model of engagement. I just, you know, you're right. Like things could blow up and things are heated right now. Right. But I just am not a believer that our two economies and societies move together. I mean, you cannot, we want to enter a new Cold War. It's a disaster for everybody, but especially for the United States. Like we can't do it. And so
I'm with you. I'm
no,
a
no, no,
former
no,
diplomat,
no,
right?
no, no, no.
20 years
But I'm
foreign
just
service. I'm on your side this time.
right, right. But just to be clear, like any, you know, CEO who calls me and asks me what we should be thinking about, I'm just like singing about engagement. Like if we want to influence what happens anywhere in any of the hot button issues, like we have to be engaged and we have to be partners. We're the two largest economies in the world, and right now the two largest trading partners in the world. And even though China is trying to pivot away, I don't see, we can't leave each other. You know, like the biggest companies in the world, you mentioned Tesla, I'll mention Apple, you know, like you know, these companies are so deeply embedded, there's no way we can let this happen. And so, you know, it's just, there are political issues and we need to be able to influence on political issues, but there are also economic issues that are central to how we produce our products. I mean, and you mentioned the East China Sea situation that happened. I mean, you know, for those who don't know what happened during that time, you know, I'm not an engineer and you know more about this than I do, Mel, but like neodymium is apparently very important for creating the magnet devices that really help audio devices, right? And so suddenly a little company like Sony stopped getting access to neodymium and they couldn't produce earbuds. And so like, you know, I think it was a statement to Japan, guys, you know, you want to play dirty and like not work with us, we can do this. And, you know, I worry about that with all of our interactions around the world. So like, I do not want us to be in a trade war. Like I think it's a mistake for everybody. And so, you know, anytime anybody asks my opinion about these, I say like engagement's better than isolation. Like we are all economically integrated and we need to figure this out. Now, to answer your second half of the question, like when you know, we have products or things getting, you know, transported to where they need for production. Of course, it's the case that China, just as is in the case in the United States, although China, it's a little more aggressive, like they can decide like what's top of the list and what's low on the list. And that's sort of how, you know, the government works, and that's how local officials work, is they can sort of figure out what's prioritized and what's not. And I guess my answer to you, Mel, is the big idea is we need to get back to an era of engagement in which we're not like fighting. You know, I was actually very hopeful about the Biden administration because I thought the Trump administration and Trump and Navarro were not helpful for this. But I was thinking that the Biden administration would kind of bring us back to engagement. And then this reemergence of the idea of competition instead of engagement, it doesn't strike me as the right way. So there have been highs and lows. I think the Biden administration sending John Kerry to meet with senior leaders was a good thing. I think Xi Jinping attending the climate summit virtually was a good thing. But I think like these tensions that we're dealing with now that are much more seem competitive. We're fundamentally economically intertwined. Like there's no way we're getting out of this. Like, you mentioned Tesla, I've mentioned Apple, like the interconnected nature of like these companies' embeddedness in the supply chain. You can't walk away from this. It's not like you can just go to Vietnam or India or somewhere else. Like this is deeply tied to what these companies are doing. And so it's just hard for me to imagine. And so I just think like the ways in which we can think about the intersection of economics, business, engagement, and diplomacy, that's kind of where I come from. Does that help?
I think that it is an excellent, positive point of view on which to wrap up our conversation today. I think that hopefully we've left enough threads dangling that those of you who are watching this session will be eager to tune in to the live question and answer portion of the summit. Doug and I will be there to interact directly with you and respond to your questions as best we can. So the summit will be taking place on November 10th, obviously via Zoom. So we hope to see you there for sure. Any closing comment, Doug?
Well, I just have one comment, Mel, and I just want to appreciate you and the team. I mean, I love the fact that you guys brought me into this because you and I clearly have some different points of view on this, but I think the ways in which you generate a conversation is you bring people in who have respectfully have differing opinions, but we can also engage with participants in how to think about these things. And so I just want to encourage all participants to think, I mean, Mel and I are both experts in these areas and have a lot of experience in different areas of the work. And so please, this isn't an argument. This is a discussion about how to move forward. And so please, everybody just engage.
Absolutely. And on that positive note, we hope to see you on November 10th. Thanks so much for watching our session today. Bye.
Bye-bye.